Hey everyone, tonight we're traveling back more than 1,000 years to the rugged shores of Scandinavia, where long winters, smoky wooden halls, and endless stretches of sea shaped nearly every part of daily life. Before you settle into your blankets, you might imagine the Vikings as fearless warriors charging into battle, roaring across the waves with axes raised high. Popular culture has done an excellent job convincing us that nearly everyone in the Viking Age spent their afternoons raiding monasteries before heading home for dinner. The reality, as it often does, was much quieter. Most Vikings were farmers. They milked cows before sunrise, repaired fences, worried about bad harvests, and spent surprising amounts of time trying to keep sheep from wandering somewhere inconvenient. It turns out that even 1,000 years ago, livestock possessed an almost supernatural talent for ignoring instructions. Among these ordinary families were countless children. They chased chickens through muddy farmyards, gathered firewood, learned to weave, watched older siblings grind grain, and slowly prepared for the responsibilities that adulthood would eventually bring. Childhood was not especially easy, but it was filled with familiar routines, family traditions, and the reassuring presence of parents who knew how to survive in a demanding landscape. Until, sometimes, they didn't. Disease arrived without warning. A fishing boat failed to return before winter storms. A father was killed during a feud. A mother died giving birth. Harsh winters claimed the elderly and the young alike. Even the healthiest families understood that death was never very far away. And so tonight, we'll gently explore a question that rarely appears in Viking stories. What happened to the children who were left behind? Did they become homeless? Were they abandoned to survive alone? Did strangers simply ignore them? Or did Viking society have ways of caring for its youngest members, even after tragedy struck? As it happens, the answer is both more practical and more compassionate than many people expect. So lower the lights, get comfortable, and let's wander slowly into the everyday world of Viking orphans. Imagine you're about 8 years old outside, cold morning mist hangs over a narrow fjord. Smoke curls from the roof of your family's longhouse. The smell of burning birch mixes with damp earth and freshly baked barley bread. Somewhere nearby, a cow announces to everyone that breakfast is apparently overdue. This morning, however, feels different. Your mother isn't tending the fire, your father isn't sharpening tools before heading into the fields. Neighbors speak quietly, relatives arrive from nearby farms. Nobody explains everything directly, because adults in every century seem to believe children understand less than they actually do. But you know, point one, or perhaps both, of your parents have died. It is a heartbreaking moment, yet unlike many stories set in medieval Europe, this was usually not the beginning of a lonely life wandering through forests, because Viking families rarely existed as isolated little households. Instead, they belonged to something much larger. Modern families often consist of parents and children living under one roof. A Viking family was usually far more complicated. Grandparents often lived nearby. Uncles and aunts remained closely connected. Adult brothers might farm neighboring land, cousins worked together throughout the year. Marriage created entirely new branches of relatives who shared responsibilities whenever hardship appeared. In other words, if something terrible happened to one household, several others immediately felt responsible. This wasn't simply kindness, it was survival. Life in Scandinavia demanded cooperation. Harvests required many hands, fishing boats needed crews, building houses required entire communities. Even preparing enough firewood before winter became a group effort. Helping orphan children meant preserving both family honor and the future workforce of the household. Practical? Absolutely. Compassionate? Often yes. The Vikings rarely separated those two ideas. One of the biggest misconceptions about Viking society is that children somehow became independent very early. Certainly, children worked, they gathered eggs, they carried water, they watched younger siblings, they learned useful skills from an early age. But work is not the same thing as being expected to survive entirely alone. Children depended heavily upon adults. Everyone understood this. A 7-year-old might know how to feed goats. That same child was not expected to negotiate land disputes, repair roofs, or survive an Arctic winter without help. Even the toughest Viking probably looked at an abandoned child and thought, well, someone should probably make sure he remembers to eat. The first people expected to help were close relatives. If a father died, surviving family members usually stepped forward. If a mother passed away, Female relatives often helped maintain daily routines until a new arrangement could be made. Grandparents sometimes became caregivers. Older siblings assumed greater responsibilities. An uncle might become something very close to a foster father. These arrangements varied widely from family to family. The Viking world stretched across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and settlements far beyond. Not every community followed identical customs, yet across the Norse world, family networks remained remarkably important. Blood ties mattered. So did reputation. No one wanted to become known as the person who ignored their own relatives in a time of need. That sort of story had an unpleasant habit of spreading around the district. Viking law also played a role, although we often picture Vikings settling disagreements with axes, and admittedly, axes did appear more often than modern lawyers. The Norse developed surprisingly detailed legal systems. Regional assemblies known as things gathered free people to settle disputes, establish agreements, and interpret customary law. These meetings discussed inheritance, marriage, land ownership, compensation after violence, and many other issues affecting everyday life. Children were part of that legal world. An orphan did not simply lose every connection to property. Inheritance customs varied depending on region and circumstance, but children often retained legitimate claims to family land or possessions. Someone had to protect those interests until the child became older. Guardians therefore carried genuine responsibilities. They weren't simply babysitters, they managed property, protected legal rights, represented children's interests, and ideally avoided spending the inheritance on unnecessary luxuries like an unusually decorative drinking horn. Of course, being a guardian wasn't always entirely selfless. Land had value. Livestock had value, tools had value. An orphan who would someday inherit a productive farm represented future wealth. Some guardians undoubtedly cared deeply for the children they raised, others may have viewed the arrangement as an economic opportunity. Human nature has remained remarkably consistent across the centuries. Most people existed somewhere between generosity and self-interest. Fortunately, Viking law generally expected guardians to preserve inherited property rather than simply helping themselves to everything. Did everyone obey perfectly? Almost certainly not. History is filled with people discovering creative interpretations of the phrase temporary management. If both parents died, life certainly became more uncertain, but uncertainty did not automatically mean abandonment. Children might move into another household belonging to relatives. Imagine arriving at your uncle's farm. The longhouse feels unfamiliar. Different dogs bark, different voices fill the room. Someone sleeps where you're accustomed to storing firewood. Meals follow slightly different routines. Even the porridge somehow tastes different. Small changes become enormous when you're a grieving child, yet slowly, ordinary life resumes. Morning chores continue. Animals still need feeding. Firewood still needs chopping. Winter still approaches with impressive punctuality. The world doesn't stop. In some ways, that steady rhythm probably offered comfort, because even after tremendous loss, daily routines quietly reminded people that life continued. Tomorrow still required breakfast, and cows, perhaps unsurprisingly, still expected to be milked. Even grief had to pause occasionally for livestock, which, admittedly, sounds rather unfair. The sheep remained blissfully unconcerned with human tragedy. They simply wanted someone to repair the fence, and if nobody did, they would enthusiastically solve the problem by escaping again. History changes, sheep do not. Corrected them before they accidentally spilled an entire bucket of milk or frightened every sheep into the neighboring valley. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next almost entirely through daily life. An orphan entering a relative's household would simply continue learning alongside everyone else. An aunt might teach spinning wool. An older cousin demonstrated fishing knots. A grandfather explained which trees burned longest through winter. An older sister showed how to bake flatbread without accidentally turning it into charcoal. Although, judging by human history, someone probably still managed to burn dinner every now and then. Some traditions never disappear. Stories were another classroom. Evenings inside the longhouse often became opportunities for storytelling. Outside, darkness covered the landscape. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Children listened while older family members told stories about heroes, explorers, legendary kings, and the Norse gods. Odin wandered the world in disguise. Thor chased giants with remarkable enthusiasm. Loki created problems that everyone else eventually had to solve. Some things, apparently, never change. Every family probably had its own favorite stories. Some were humorous, some were cautionary, some explained family history, others reminded children where they came from and why their ancestors mattered. For an orphan, these evenings carried particular importance. Stories became bridges connecting the child to parents who were no longer there. Perhaps someone would say, "Your father loved this tale." Or, "Your mother always laughed at this part." Little memories survived inside ordinary 100 points face screaming in fear conversations long after voices were gone. Children also inherited responsibilities. If an older brother died alongside his parents, a younger sibling might eventually take over duties that previously belonged to someone else, perhaps tending more sheep, helping repair fences, learning to row sooner than expected. Life did not pause simply because someone was missing. Instead, families quietly adjusted. Everyone carried just a little more. This wasn't always easy, but communities became remarkably skilled at adapting. Centuries of harsh weather had taught Scandinavians one simple lesson: survival belonged to those who helped one another. Girls and boys often experienced these years somewhat differently. Young girls learned spinning, weaving, sewing, cooking, preserving food, and managing household stores. These were not considered minor skills, quite the opposite. Running a Viking household required enormous knowledge. One mistake in preserving food could mean serious hunger later in winter. One poorly woven cloak might fail to keep someone warm. One forgotten sack of grain might attract unwelcome mice. Domestic work demanded planning, patience, and experience. Young boys usually spent more time learning farming, woodworking, fishing, animal care, and eventually sailing. Again, these roles varied. Reality rarely fit perfectly into neat categories. Every farm had different needs, every family faced different challenges. Everyone simply learned whatever skills helped the household survive, and survival, more often than not, outweighed tradition. Something else deserves mentioning: many Viking children did not become orphans because of warfare. Popular imagination loves dramatic battles, axes collide, ships burn, everyone shouts. Reality was less cinematic. Disease claimed countless lives, childbirth remained dangerous, infections spread quickly, accidents happened during farming, hunting, and fishing. Even an ordinary winter could prove deadly. For many orphan children, there was no glorious battle, only illness arriving quietly and leaving an empty place beside the hearth. Perhaps this is one reason Viking communities developed such practical ways of caring for children. Loss was familiar, almost every family experienced it sooner or later. Remarriage also changed children's lives. Widows sometimes remarried, widowers did as well. Marriage in Viking society often served practical purposes alongside affection. A farm needed workers, children needed caregivers, property required management. A new husband or wife could provide stability for an entire household. Of course, blending families has never been completely simple. It wasn't simple 1,000 years ago either. Imagine suddenly sharing your home with stepbrothers, stepsisters, and unfamiliar adults. Someone else sits in your father's chair, someone else prepares meals the way your mother never did. Even small differences feel enormous, yet over time, many families undoubtedly settled into new rhythms. People are surprisingly adaptable, especially children. Friendships also mattered. Children worked together almost constantly. They collected berries, watched livestock, gathered driftwood, played simple games whenever chores allowed. An orphan did not suddenly lose every friendship, those relationships continued. Neighbors still recognized familiar faces. Children still laughed together even in difficult times. Ordinary moments continued appearing with remarkable persistence. Someone slipped in the mud, someone chased an escaped goat, someone accidentally frightened the chickens. Life insisted upon continuing. Fortunately, archaeologists occasionally uncover tiny objects that remind us just how ordinary Viking childhood could be: small wooden toys, miniature boats, little carved animals, game pieces worn smooth by countless hands. These discoveries tell us something important: children played even in a demanding world. Even after hardship, adults clearly believed childhood deserved moments of happiness. A carved horse may seem like a small thing, but someone took the time to make it. Someone smiled while handing it to a child. Someone watched little hands push it across a wooden floor beside the warm fire. History often remembers kings, archaeology sometimes remembers toys, and toys can tell remarkably gentle stories. Perhaps the greatest gift a Viking community could offer an orphan was something wonderfully ordinary: belonging. Not endless sympathy, not dramatic speeches, simply belonging. A place beside the fire. A wooden bowl at supper, warm wool blankets before winter storms, someone reminding you to fetch water, someone praising your first successful Loaf of bread, someone laughing when you accidentally dropped an entire basket of turnips into the stream. Although admittedly, retrieving turnips from cold water was probably less amusing for the person responsible. Still, shared laughter has always been one of humanity's quietest forms of healing, even in the Viking Age, especially in the Viking Age, because life there demanded resilience, not the loud, heroic kind celebrated in epic poems, but the quiet resilience found in ordinary families who simply kept going, one peaceful morning after another. And somewhere inside one of those longhouses, a child who had once feared facing the world alone slowly realized that an entire community had, almost without ceremony, made room for them. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't always easy, but it was home. Years passed almost without anyone noticing. The child who had once needed help carrying a single bucket of water now lifted two with practiced ease. The small hands that had struggled to split kindling grew steady enough to swing a proper axe. The frightened orphan slowly became another dependable member of the household. It rarely happened all at once, growing up seldom does. Instead, it arrived quietly, hidden inside hundreds of ordinary mornings. One day, someone simply trusted you with a task they would not have trusted you with the year before. Perhaps it was taking the sheep to higher pastures alone, perhaps rowing across a calm fjord to check fishing nets before sunrise, or perhaps being left in charge of younger children while the adults worked in the fields. Trust, in Viking society, was earned through actions far more often than words. Every completed chore became a small promise kept, every responsibility carried well made the next one possible. By the time a Viking child reached the early teenage years, few people still thought of them as simply a child. There was no magical birthday that suddenly transformed someone into an adult. Instead, adulthood arrived gradually. More work, more expectations, more independence. Life itself became the teacher. An orphan often matured especially quickly, not because they wished to but because difficult circumstances sometimes asked more from them than from others. If there was fencing to repair, they learned. If animals wandered away, they searched until they were found. If storms damaged the roof, they climbed alongside everyone else to mend it before the next rain arrived. No one expected perfection, but everyone expected effort. And effort mattered. On many farms, skills became a person's greatest treasure. A young man who knew how to build a sturdy boat or shape straight timber was valuable to every community. The young woman who could weave strong wool, preserve food through the winter, and manage a household wisely possessed knowledge just as essential. These abilities were not merely useful, they kept families alive. The Vikings understood something wonderfully practical. Gold could be stolen, silver could disappear, but knowledge carried inside your own hands remained with you wherever you went. Many young people also learned from specialists within their communities. A talented blacksmith might allow an eager teenager to pump the bellows, shape simple nails, or watch glowing iron transform beneath a hammer. A skilled shipbuilder could explain why one piece of oak belonged in the keel while another was better suited for the ribs of a longship. A merchant returning from distant lands might describe bustling markets. Philly appeared quietly, not on battlefields, but around ordinary dinner tables. As evening arrived, paper lanterns glowed softly throughout the village. The family gathered together. Rice steamed gently inside wooden bowls. Miso soup warmed tired hands. Someone laughed at a child's innocent mistake while practicing calligraphy. For a few precious moments, life felt wonderfully ordinary again. The empty place once occupied by the fallen warrior remained. No one tried to erase it. Instead, they learned to live beside it. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. The samurai believed that duty did not end with death. The warrior had fulfilled his duty on the battlefield. Now, his family fulfilled theirs at home. Together, quietly, season after season, they carried his legacy forward, not through revenge or endless mourning, but through resilience, compassion, and the simple determination to keep the household alive. Tonight, our journey reaches its final chapter. The battlefield has long since fallen silent. The armor has been carefully polished and placed inside a wooden chest. The family swords still hang proudly upon the wall, but years have passed since anyone drew them in anger. The children who once stood beside their father's grave are now grandparents themselves, telling stories to a new generation gathered around the warm glow of an evening lantern. History often ends when the warrior dies, but real life continues. And sometimes, the quiet years that follow shape a family's future far more than any single battle ever could. So let us return one last time to that peaceful samurai home and discover what became of the descendants of those who served with honor. Spring arrives once again. Cherry blossoms drift gently across the garden, settling on smooth stepping stones beside a small pond where colorful carp glide lazily through clear water. Inside the house, very little seems different. The family still bows before the household shrine each morning. Fresh flowers are placed beside the memorial tablets. A bowl of rice. A cup of tea. A stick of incense. These small rituals have continued for decades. The youngest children barely know why they are performed. To them, the ancestor whose name is spoken each morning has always been a story. Yet that story quietly shapes who they become. Grandfather begins speaking after breakfast. His voice has grown softer with age. He tells the children about the warrior whose portrait hangs inside the family alcove. He was your great-grandfather. He loved horses. He always shared his meals with tired travelers. He believed that courage meant protecting those weaker than yourself. The children listen carefully. Not because they dream of battle, but because every family treasures its own history. These stories become invisible threads connecting one generation to the next. Years continue passing. Long periods of peace replace generations of warfare. For many samurai families, this is both a blessing and a challenge. There are fewer battles to fight. But there are also fewer opportunities to prove military skill. Instead, education becomes increasingly important. Young boys spend long hours studying history, ethics, mathematics, and Chinese classics. Their handwriting must be elegant. Japan itself slowly changes. Their manners must be flawless. A careless word can damage a family's reputation just as quickly as a careless sword stroke once could. Many become teachers. Others serve as judges, government officials, scholars, or advisors. The meaning of being a samurai slowly begins to change. Honor is no longer measured only through courage in battle. It is measured through wisdom, integrity, patience, service to society. Even daughters receive greater opportunities to develop literary and artistic talents. Poetry gatherings become popular. Tea ceremonies teach mindfulness and respect. Flower arranging transforms simple branches into quiet works of beauty. The household remains disciplined, but it also becomes more peaceful than ever before. Then, after centuries of tradition, the greatest change arrives. In the 19th century, Japan enters an age of extraordinary transformation. Steamships appear along the coast. Railways stretch across the countryside. Western clothing becomes fashionable. Factories replace many traditional workshops. The old feudal system that had supported samurai families for generations begins to disappear. The government announces sweeping reforms. Samurai stipends are gradually abolished. The exclusive right to carry swords in public comes to an end. For families whose identity had been tied to military service for hundreds of years, this is almost impossible to imagine. Many quietly remove the two swords that had symbolized their status. They wrap them carefully in silk cloth. Some place them inside family storehouses. Others display them as treasured heirlooms rather than everyday tools. For the first time in centuries, being born into a samurai family no longer determines one's future. Some descendants welcome the change. They become doctors, engineers, teachers, business owners, journalists, military officers in Japan's modern army. Others struggle. Without government stipends, many households face financial hardship. A few are forced to sell ancestral armor simply to purchase food. Beautiful helmets crafted generations earlier leave the family forever. Ancient swords pass into the hands of collectors. It is a painful reminder that even history can sometimes be traded for survive. Yet something remarkable refuses to disappear. The values. Parents continue teaching honesty, self-discipline, respect for elders, responsibility toward one's community. Children still hear stories of ancestors who acted with kindness as well as courage. The family no longer serves a daimyo. Instead, they serve society in new ways. The spirit remains, even as the world changes around it. Today, many Japanese families can trace their ancestry back to samurai households. Some still preserve centuries-old documents tucked carefully inside wooden boxes. Others own family swords that are displayed only on special occasions. Many maintain graves where generations gather each year to clean the stone, offer fresh flowers, and remember those who came before. Visitors often imagine these objects are the most important inheritance. But perhaps they are not. The greatest inheritance cannot be locked inside a chest. It cannot rust. It cannot be sold. It lives in stories passed quietly from grandparents to grandchildren. Stories of loyalty shown without expectation of reward. Stories of perseverance during difficult winters. Stories of families who remained united after losing someone they loved. So, what happened to samurai families after a warrior died? Most did not disappear. They mourned. They adapted. They raised children. They protected traditions. They survived political upheaval, economic hardship, and centuries of change. Some grew wealthy, others faded into poverty. Many became ordinary citizens whose descendants would eventually ride trains instead of horses, write with fountain pens instead of ink brushes, and wear business suits instead of armor. Yet deep within many households, the memory of one fallen warrior continued to shape generation after generation. His greatest legacy was never the battles he fought. It was the family that quietly carried his values into the future. And as the evening grows still, the paper lantern burns a little lower, the last cherry blossom drifts softly across the garden, and the old wooden house settles peacefully into silence, its story not ending with a warrior's death, but continuing through every child, every grandchild, and every quiet act of honor that followed.